Okay, so this is a heavy-duty page. Let me draw you down there to the bottom of the page. Under where it says oxygen-hemoglobin dissociation curve, there's two indented bullet points. One of them says, in the lungs, PO2 is around 100 millimeters of mercury. We're looking at nearly full saturation in the lungs, about 98% saturation. Bottom of 83. Did I say a different page again? Yeah, go back to the bottom of 83. Okay, bottom of 83, you'll notice two indented bullet points in the lungs. PO2 is nearly 100 millimeters of mercury pressure, and that means we're about fully saturated, 98% saturation in the lungs. Notice in the body cells and tissues, PO2 is about 40 millimeters of mercury. Notice that we didn't drop saturation greatly. We only dropped to about 75% saturation. What does 75% saturation really mean?
3 oxygen molecules.
Partially saturated, that's about 3 oxygen molecules per hemoglobin. So that means only about 25% of the oxygen is actually moved into the surrounding cells and tissues. So why is it that most of the oxygen stays bound to hemoglobin? Waiting for the demand. It's a backup supply. So in case demand suddenly increases, you don't have 0 oxygen being transported. You do have a backup supply here in transport. So that's why about 25% of oxygen actually gets unloaded at our cells and tissues. The other 75% of that oxygen continues to go for a ride on the hemoglobin. It's a backup supply. Okay, so what we've actually done is we've talked about the picture in 84, and we've talked about the information right below it called factors that influence how oxygen binds to hemoglobin. I did want to briefly mention to you a little bit about carbon monoxide poisoning down at the very bottom of page 84. So where do you find carbon monoxide?
In the garage.
Garage? Yeah. Crank up the car, leave the garage door closed, and bye-bye. Yeah, go to sleep. Because carbon monoxide is produced from combustion engines or things that burn fuel. So things like gasoline engines are terrific sources of CO. CO, carbon monoxide, is 1 oxygen molecule or 1 oxygen atom rather away from carbon dioxide. Carbon monoxide is also found in cigarettes. Our bodies actually produce a tiny, tiny amount of carbon monoxide as well. But of course it's not dangerous since we produce it, our bodies can handle it. Notice down there the second bullet point, carbon monoxide binds with hemoglobin 200 times faster than oxygen. Wow. The other dangerous thing about carbon monoxide, it binds irreversibly with hemoglobin. Going back to this picture here, it binds on the same location. It binds to the iron on that heme group. The carbon dioxide is really greedy here. It says, I'm first, I get to go for the ride. It binds to the iron group and then it doesn't let go. So it doesn't play nice here. If you prevent oxygen from binding, what happens to a person's oxygen level? Decrease, yeah. So you've got real problems here with getting oxygen transported to cells and tissues because carbon monoxide is actually taking up that seat on hemoglobin. So the problem for carbon monoxide poison is it robs you of your available oxygen supplies. It irreversibly binds. So the way to get it off of the bloodstream is to force in 100% saturation either through the nose, through just an oxygen supply, or if a person has a really bad case of carbon monoxide poisoning, put them in a hyperbaric chamber, and that forces the carbon monoxide off and allows oxygen then to be transported. So, real dangerous thing, and especially people who have, homes that have carbon monoxide in there, or God forbid a garage where the door's shut and cars running, and that gas builds up in pressure there. Let's talk about carbon dioxide over on page, 85. This is in your book on page 740. Carbon dioxide, of course, is the waste gas that our bodies produce as a result of cellular respiration in those mitochondria. You'll notice here there's 3 methods for transport of CO2. Blood plasma is one way for us to transport. And on your worksheet, that's actually number 3. Looks like less than 10% is actually transported, dissolved in the blood plasma. Carbon dioxide can also bind to the hemoglobin on the red blood cells. But this is different. Let's go back to that hemoglobin molecule one more time. Hemoglobin is a protein. Proteins are built from amino acids. Carbon dioxide does not prefer to bind with the iron of the heme group. Rather, carbon dioxide binds where? Globin. Good. So it tends to bind with the amino acids of the globin chains here. So it's not competing with oxygen at all for space to rise. So a hemoglobin molecule can actually transport both oxygen and carbon dioxide at the very same time and not have an issue of competing molecules for competing space. The most common way, you might have noticed here, for carbon dioxide to be transported is dissolved in the bloodstream as the bicarbonate ion. And here's a sneak preview of where we're going to be heading with this. Thinking about internal versus external respiration, where does your body put carbon dioxide from cells and tissues into the bloodstream? Internal. Because what we're doing is all of your body cells and tissues, those mitochondria are making ATP and pumping out CO2. CO2 is highest in concentration in your body cells. That promotes it to move to your capillaries. So notice here in your systemic capillaries, carbon dioxide is loaded into the bloodstream. This little equation shows what happens to carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide joins with the water that's in your blood plasma. It forms this unstable middleman called carbonic acid. Carbonic acid has H2CO3. This is unstable and it quickly breaks down into hydrogen ions and a bicarbonate ion. Hydrogen ions do what to a solution?
Make it acidic?
Make it acidic, good. So hydrogen ions acidify your bloodstream, and the bicarbonate ion there is how carbon dioxide is transported. You can actually see part of that chemical, HCO3, contains CO2. So the most common transport mechanism for carbon dioxide is as the bicarbonate ion, literally dissolves in the bloodstream, becomes part of that water molecule, forms a reaction there. The bicarbonate molecule or bicarbonate ion is transported back to the lungs, and notice here at the lungs, it is now time for the carbon dioxide to leave. So the reaction runs in reverse. The bicarbonate ion forms carbonic acid. Carbonic acid will then form carbon dioxide and water, now getting it back to a gas form so that you can exhale that CO2 out of the alveolar air sac. So we say at the lungs, carbon dioxide is now unloaded from your pulmonary capillaries into your alveolar air sac so you can exhale it. How is the loading and unloading different for oxygen? Do you load and unload at the same place? Opposite, yeah. Because where you're unloading carbon dioxide from the bloodstream into the air, you're doing the exact opposite. You're taking oxygen and placing it into the bloodstream for transport. Likewise, at our systemic capillaries and our tissues, we do the very opposite thing. If we're loading carbon dioxide into the bloodstream, now what we're going to do is unload oxygen out so that we can use it. So again, the opposite in internal versus external respiration. Where does internal respiration take place? Cells and tissues and those capillaries all over your body. Think back to our last couple of chapters. We just got through talking about capillary exchange. We were specifically talking about fluids pushed out and then fluids reabsorbed back in. This is different from that because this operates under the concept of simply being diffusion. diffusing the molecules in and out of the bloodstream. So this is not filtration and reabsorption. This is just simply diffusion, getting those blood gases exchanged.
So on internal, the carbon dioxide is exiting the cells, going into the blood.
Right.
Oxygen is leaving the blood, coming in to the cells.
Yeah.
With external, the CO2 is being pumped out of the body into the lungs.
Right.
And the oxygen is coming out of the lungs into the body.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And the most common transport method for oxygen is how?
Diffusion.
Diffusion, and then it rides on heme, yes, rides on the heme, on the hemoglobin. And the most common transport method for CO2? Bicarbonate, right. The important thing to catch here is that when you make bicarbonate ion, you also release hydrogen ions because hydrogen ions make the blood acidic. This is how we control respiration rate. Because the more acidic your blood becomes, the faster you breathe, because that means what is accumulating in your bloodstream? Carbon dioxide. So the faster you breathe, the more you can exhale and get rid of that CO2. So that's the important thing here about making bicarbonate. We actually also release hydrogen ions. Hydrogen ions acidify the bloodstream. All right. How you doing so far?
Saturation.
Saturation. Yeah, you probably are saturated. What happened for you?
In that situation, for the carbon dioxide line
It's just the amino acids on the globin chain. So I would just know that amino acids take in carbon dioxide for transport. It's not the heme group.
Okay, the oxygen, who's going to
The iron on the heme group.
So the O2 binds to the iron on the heme.
Right.
And what about CO2?
CO2 binds to the amino acids of the protein chain. On the bottom of the page, you've seen before, but it was for the heart. You might recall in what portion of the brain houses that vasomotor center?
Medulla oblongata.
Medulla oblongata. Notice here, we're back again for another visit. This time we call it the respiratory center. It's in the medulla oblongata and the pons. So we're talking about control of respiration from that portion of the brain. This inspiratory center, or respiratory center as it's called, is actually a cluster of neurons discharge impulses to the diaphragm. They can actually control the rate at which the diaphragm controls your breathing. So if you tell your diaphragm to contract, it's going to move inferiorly. What happens to volume? Increase volume and decrease pressure. Good. So there's your blank. As a result, the thorax volume increases and pressure decreases.